Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Kevin Connors. Today, we're going to be going over our first section on cancer genes, and we're going to try to keep these videos short so they're more easily digested. But this first one, we got to kind of understand what we're looking at when we're looking at somebody's genetic profile. So I shared my screen with you, and we're going to go over what we're going to look at. This is a sample person's genetics and what this actually means. So the report that we're looking at, and I know there's many different types of reports out there, the one that we're using is through DNAsupplementation.com. And I like that report because it is the most inclusive of the genes, of all the genes that you can get through your 23andMe or through the genetic profile that we do here in our office, which is a little bit different. And it gives us the biggest array of SNPs to look at. So what are we looking at? Hopefully you've watched some of the other videos on what is a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism, or what's called a variant, or in my terminology, I tend to use the word defect, because I'm a little old school. But as we look at a person's gene, we're looking at a family of genes. So in this example, this is the HLA family. There's 5 genes in the family that we're looking at here. And these genes, this is an individual gene, will either have 1 defect, 2 defects, or no defects or variants. You receive an allele from your mother and 1 from your father, and that's where you're getting these different genetic variants. So you inherit them. Now you can have a genetic variant because of a toxic issue that affected your gene, and that may be why some of these variants occurred at some point in time. Maybe your father was exposed to a toxin, maybe your mother was, maybe your great-grandfather was, that caused a defect or a variant in that gene, and now they passed it on to their offspring. So that's what we're looking at here. In this particular sample patient, this HLA gene, this particular gene has a single nucleotide polymorphism or a heterogeneous polymorphism. Instead of here, this one here has a double nucleotide polymorphism or a 2 or a homogeneous polymorphism. So most of the genes we want to have a 0 or, as this report shows, a blank. So that's what we want to see on most of the genes. If you have a 1, that gene isn't going to do its job quite as well. If you have a 2, that gene isn't going to do its job quite as well, even more. Now, just because you have a 2 does not mean that the gene's not going to work at all. It means that it's not going to do its job quite as well. Now, some genes you'd actually may want to have a variant on. Here would be one, caffeine metabolism, this cytochrome P450 gene. If you have a defect on this gene, you will process caffeine more quickly. So if I have a defect, if this was me, if I have a defect on this gene, if I drink coffee, then it will make me have to go to the bathroom a little bit quicker. If I have a 2 there, I drink coffee, I got to pee right away because it's processing through me very quickly. So a defect on this cytochrome P450 pathway, at least what we know now, increases the metabolic rate of how you process caffeine, and it goes out of your body quicker. So if you like coffee, you want to have a 1 or a 2 here. People that have a blank or a 0 here, and they're coffee drinkers, they're also usually telling me, oh, coffee doesn't make me have to go to the bathroom. I could drink a whole pot and I don't have to go to the bathroom. Well, you have a 0 here. You probably shouldn't be drinking that much coffee because caffeine is going to have more ill effects on you because it stays in your system longer. So that's how we look at the genes. So we're looking at the different specific SNPs, what they do to your body. Never are we treating a gene defect. You don't treat it. This is going to be with you the rest of your life. This is your genes. They could get worse if you had a toxic exposure and now you have a defect on a specific gene. But for the most part, they're going to stay the same your whole life. You don't treat the genes. You support the pathway, yes, possibly, but you're not treating the genes. Okay, so let's get to the topic of today. We covered that, what I just said, in other slides and presentations that didn't talk about specifically our cancer gene book. So we want to talk about the gut genes today. We're going to talk about some different gut genes. Some of them have what to do with histamine. Histamine is an important immune immune molecule that does very good things to our body. We need to have histamine in our body. Histamine is a response to an antigen, meaning that's something that's sparking an immune response, and it helps dilute and get rid of that antigen. It helps kill any infection around that antigen, and it helps get that carried away. However, histamine then has to be gotten rid of. So histamine is produced in an antigen immune response. But then we have ways to get rid of histamine to help carry that out of our body. Well, our body makes this enzyme called the DAO enzyme through a few genes. Let's take a look at that. Because if we have defects on those histamine genes, then we can have issues in our body. So we're going to jump to these ABP1 genes here and these HNMT genes here. These are genes that get rid of histamine in our body. It's generally believed that these ABP1 genes really work in the gut itself. So this person here has no defects on these ABP1 genes. So they have no trouble making this DAO enzyme in the gut. This is a picture of the lining of the gut. These are the little villi of the intestines. These are the gut cells themselves. This is the lumen of the gut where food would be sitting to be absorbed. So if I have enough ABP1 genes to be able to make that histamine in the gut, then I won't have an issue with histamine that I consume. What do you mean? Well, you consume foods that have a lot of histamine. Kombucha is really good for you, but it's got a lot of histamine. Lunch meats, aged things, aged meats, eggs, strawberries, all are things that have a lot of histamines in them. This person can eat all those really that they want, per se, because they make enough DAO enzyme to break down that histamine. The HNMT gene makes some of the histamine for the gut, but makes most of the histamine enzyme. It doesn't make the histamine, it makes the enzyme that breaks down the histamine. It makes the enzyme that breaks down histamine in the tissue. So HNMT gene gets rid of histamine in the tissue, does help in the gut, but it's mainly these enzymes that make the DAO enzyme to break down histamine in the gut. So histamine in the tissue is made by your body. So your body makes, your immune system makes histamine. Mast cells release histamine in the tissue in the presence of an antigen, meaning something that's in the tissue that shouldn't be there. You breathe in a lot of pollen that absorbed through your lungs. You got pollen circulating through your bloodstream. Histamine is released by your mast cells to try to take care of that pollen. And people that have issues with allergies, usually you see a lot of defects on the HNMT genes. Now this person has some defects, which could cause some issues. But people that have defects like, well, maybe twice as many as this are the people that have seasonal allergy problems. They don't get rid of the histamine that their body is producing because defects on these genes cause a decrease in production of the DAO enzyme that gets rid of histamine in the tissue. So we can tell a lot about a person by just looking at their genes, even if we don't have a history, because we can say, wow, do you bet you have some allergies? Probably not this person, but a person with twice as many defects as this. And they could say, wow, yeah, I do. I have some seasonal allergies. I've had people with literally twos all the way through here, and they are just little allergy little queens. And that becomes a big issue. Now, we could use a product like Histamine Scavenger or GI Assist if there was a lot of defects in here too, to help give the DAO enzyme to a person in the gut. But the DAO enzyme itself, if you give it to the person to swallow, they don't absorb it well, so it really doesn't work for the tissues itself. So then you have to use a product like Histamine Scavenger, which is has a lot of anti-inflammatories in there to get rid of histamine in the tissue. And it is more of a challenge. So when you see defects in here, think histamine issues. When we talk about cancer, what does cancer have to do with histamine? Well, there's numerous studies that talk about different cancers that absorb and utilize histamine as a fuel source. So when we look at a cancer person's genes, these genes are really important here because a lot of defects in here can ramp up histamine in the tissue, leaving a fuel source for cancer in the tissue, can be absorbed by the cancer and can be gobbled up by the cancer. So decreasing histamine levels with cancer patients can be very important. Now, if a person has cancer and they don't have any defects in here, then it's a good chance that histamine is not a fuel source for that cancer, which is good. But if they do have a lot of defects, then we definitely want to support this. Also, these FUT2 genes are very important for the gut as well. The FUT2 genes help the gut make butyrate, help the gut cells heal themselves. So FUT2 gene, if a person has a lot of defects in here, and this person has a considerable number of defects, you really want to support this pathway. So we use a product called Sun Spectrum. Very commonly we use for nearly all our cancer patients, because I have literally had 0 cancer patients up to this time that didn't have a lot of defects in their FUT2 genes. Very important gene for gut health and very important gene for cancer patients. So supporting the FUT2 gene, supporting gut health is by all means important. The BCMO genes are put under the gut section because this is how you absorb and utilize the beta carotene. That's why it's named BCMO. It's a beta carotene oxygenase gene. Now, vitamin A, that's where beta carotene sources, is super important for epithelial tissue. That's the tissue that lines the gut. And it's super important for cancer patients. So we are deficient in vitamin A, and most sources of vitamin A that we are taking are not good whole food sources. They're synthetic sources, which are not good for us. So very common with cancer, we see a BCMO gene picture that looks just like this. This is not good, by the way. We can also take a look at this by looking at, now you can't, as a patient, when I give you a copy of yours because you don't have the program, but as we go over it, we can click on this little button and the program gives us a picture of where the client is, the client in this picture, compared to the mean. Now we have about 25,000 people in this program. So, but understand, so that's what makes up the mean, is the 25,000 people, but understand this isn't a healthy cohort study of 25,000 healthy people. The people that are in this program are cancer patients and Lyme patients and quite ill people, most of them, not all of them, that wanted to get their genes run because they were lacking health. So if we had a healthy cohort of 25,000 people, the mean would be probably a little bit to the left of this. So we never want to be to the right of the mean. We really want to be far to the left of the mean because that would be more towards normal in the population. Everybody's going to have some defects. But when we look at someone far to the right of the mean like this, that becomes an issue. So there's going to be very few people that have no defects in any of these genes. Everybody's going to have some defects. You can live just fine with a lot of defects in these genes, but when you add environmental things on top of this, then we start to see problems. So we can look at this little button and see where we are compared to, the rest of the people in this group, which can be very helpful. Now, very common that sick people have FUT2 gene defects because one could argue that maybe a good part of all diseases begins in the gut, maybe, yeah. Well, gut issues could be a leading cause of many different diseases. So that is a very common defect to have. So the main gut issues, the main gut genes are the BCMO genes, very important for cancer patients. FUT2 genes, very important for cancer patients. The ABP1 and the HNMT, which have to do with with histamine are very important because this can be a feeder of cancer. And then we get into the oxalate genes. Now, the oxalate genes aren't going to be a feeder for cancer, but the oxalate genes can cause other issues. So the oxalate genes have to do with your ability to break down oxalates that are in your food, which is just a substance in really good food, in vegetables and such. Spinach and rhubarb and a whole bunch of really good vegetables have oxalates in them. However, you're not supposed to be you're not supposed to be absorbing oxalates. They're supposed to be broken down in the food by genes, by enzymes made by these genes. So when we don't make the enzymes because we have a lot of defects on these genes, and this person doesn't, so I wouldn't even talk about it with this person. But if you had twos throughout here and such, we're going to have a deficiency in I should say, a decreased ability to make those enzymes to break down oxalates. We'll absorb more oxalates. We'll be much more prone to stone formation. These are the people that form more gallstones and kidney stones and liver stones. And you do want to address this. So it's very nice when we look at somebody's genes and maybe they come in with stage 4 colon cancer and they're not really worried about stones right now. But if we have defects in here, then you can inform them so that they can tell their children to start dealing with this, because this is something that you can pretty effectively reduce stone formation by helping your body get rid of oxalates in the gut. So it's something that you can address. We use some different products for that that tend to work quite well. So these are the gut genes that we'll start with on this little presentation. As always, remember our disclaimer. We're not making health claims here. You need to still talk to your doctor and elsewhere, as we need to do as a disclaimer for the book. All right, hopefully that helped, and we'll continue to get videos your way.